last discussion to the last panel, the last moments of our time together. I'm just going to give a few more moments. It's been an incredible conversation today. I have learned so much. My brain is overflowing. I suspect a lot of you feel the same way. I'm going to take this moment to remind you of a few final things. Please do try the engagement features on the Whova app. There's a leaderboard there. We're going to give a prize to the top 2 engagers. Those 2 are currently Jalen El Sarha and Buckley Brinkman. They have been in first and second position for most of the day, although they actually just switched. Buckley was first, now he's second. So you've got a few more minutes to compete there. Also, I'm going to remind you, if you will, use our hashtag for the day, manufacturing racial justice. That's what we're here to talk about, and we want to really change the future. And then finally, you know, we've got a ton of folks that have registered for today, and we have the ability to connect using the Whova app and really created a pathway for you to continue the conversation far after this conference has ended. So I'm going to remind you to use all of that. Now, without further ado, it's my job to bring up the person who's going to be introducing our speaker for this afternoon. And I'm excited to introduce Carl West, who is the CEO and publisher of TBT News and MG Media. Carl, I would love to have you jump on and say hello.
Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction, but most importantly, thanks everyone for tuning in to this incredible conference that is going on today. This topic is extremely exciting, but yet somewhat disturbing because in a city like Chicago. But let me first go back to introducing who I am. Carl West. I am the founder and managing editor of TBT News. That's Truth Be Told News here in Chicago. I launched this digital platform 10 years ago last year. I had a big celebration of Salute the Black Excellence planned, and COVID just killed that whole thing. And so I'm hoping to pull that off sometime later this year. I am a man who believes in celebrating and acknowledging Black excellence. So at my anniversary, I was going to acknowledge a host of people who, in my mind, who stand for Black excellence, who are fighting for the cause of freedom and liberation and equality, as well as equity, definitely here in my city. And I'm also the chairman of the board of Black United Fund of Illinois. It is abbreviated Buffy. We are a 35-year-old organization that's dealing with economic empowerment, job placement, and youth and education. And I am excited because I became the chairman about 2 years ago. And the guy, Henry English, who founded the organization, was actually one of my mentors. He brought me in 15, 20 years ago. He kept me around the organization, and he really thought it was time for me to join the board. I did that. 2 years later, he ended up dying, unfortunately, in a car accident. And the board and all of the founding members who knew our close relationship thought I would be the great person to run the organization for the next duration, whatever that looks like. And so it is a very well respected organization here in Chicago and Illinois. And I'm excited to be the chairman. I've been doing work on that all day long as I waited for this conference participation to come up. So with that being said, that's sort of my story. It's a small portion of my story. Again, I'm excited to be a part of this. When I got the call to participate, I looked at the list of people. That gave me another level of excitement, but I'm always excited to participate in talking about equity and how we can do more to be inclusive to Black folks in all industries, but in particular in the manufacturing industry. Here in Chicago, of course, the unions are like gangbusters. And so when we have anything, Chicago was a major manufacturing town for decades. And since the digital revolution came along, probably 10 or 15 years ago in this high stage, it kind of interrupted the manufacturing industry here in Chicago and in the state of Illinois. And David Robinson, being associated with the manufacturing industry here in Chicago, He told me about what was going on the west side of Chicago, what they was doing with this organization, and I just thought it was absolutely incredible. And the fact that it had visions of inclusivity, which is always the biggest thing going on here in Chicago. Again, the unions control a lot of the manufacturing jobs, even the digital jobs here in Chicago. The unions have a strong hold on it, and it makes it very difficult for Black people to find a way through and to be able to rise up the ladder in terms of contracts, in terms of employment. I mean, there are areas in Chicago where if you drive through and you see work going on some of the roads that, there is no Black people on these roads. So it is absolutely incredible how we go and we talk to our politicians, our elected officials, and they really don't have an answer for why Black folks are not being included in these high-paying jobs in manufacturing and construction. So having a panel like this today and a conference like this, hopefully we've got some insight into how we can combat that situation. So with that being said, I want to now introduce our keynote. He's an incredible gentleman. Met him recently, did some research on him, did some homework. His background is impeccable, and I'm going to give a brief overview of his background because it's too extensive to try to cover it in this short period of time. So Derek Hamilton is a university professor. He is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race, Stratification, and Political Economy at the New School. Considered to be one of the nation's foremost scholars, economists, and public intellectuals. I love that word, intellectuals. I love to put people into these intellectual spaces. If I had to do over again, I would be an intellectual. But anyway, Hamilton's accomplishments include recently being profiled in the New York Times, Mother Jones Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, and being featured in Political Magazine's 2017 50 Ideas Shaping American Politics and the People Behind Them issue. Hamilton has been involved in crafting policy proposals such as baby bonds and a federal job guarantee, which has garnered a great deal of media attention and served as an inspiration for legislative proposals at the federal, state, and local level. After a brief bio like that, with those few accomplishments, but many, many more, again, that I can't go into, let me introduce Mr. Derek Hamilton. Derek, it's on you.
You are very generous. I appreciate you, Carl, and you are certainly an intellectual. So I'm going to frame my remarks, and I know I'm the last thing between you and the closing, around thinking of the public sector's role in promoting a new industrial policy and thinking about infrastructure in an expansive way, and also considering the role of race. Stimulus plans championed on both sides of the political aisle use tax incentives and deregulation to cajole or bribe a private sector that already has low tax bill and record-breaking profit levels to provide more jobs and rebuild our nation's crumbling infrastructure. That approach leaves workers vulnerable to the whimsical nature of trickle-down employment and the instability of contingent work. Moreover, it's also often a transfer of the value of our public infrastructure assets to corporate interests with no guarantee that the infrastructure will actually be built in the first place. This corporate targeted stimulus further entrenches our already distorted labor market bargaining power away from workers in favor of firms. Yet, in this framework, the promise trickle down from this neoliberal supply side economics has never come to fruition. This neoliberal paradigm resulted from assaults on public power in a way that distracted resources away from labor and social welfare while facilitating elite and corporate interests. What's more, anti-Black rhetoric that demonized and weaponized racial tensions and demonized recipients of public provisions with anti-Black imagery of super predators welfare queens, and deadbeat dads was used to implement this political regime. In order to fully understand how we can have our concentrated economic and political power and how that power can persist at the top for so long without widespread inclusion, we have to embrace a third element in relationship of political and economic power, and that is race. Or more broadly, the existence of some permanent underclass marked by a subaltern identity by which more dominant identity groups, in the US case, that's white, are able to maintain the status quo because they're willing to sacrifice a vertical positioning, in other words, as we become more unequal, in exchange for horizontal positioning, in other words, social status. The economic and political dominant group will have social status relative to some other group. That becomes the trade-off. In essence, devaluing or othering of individuals based on social identities like race, it relates to our political notions of who's deserving and who's undeserving. And if we're able to redress that, it's essential for us to understand the conception of race beyond individual transactions into its workings of our larger political economy structures that affect us all. Without potent policy alternatives to that neoliberal paradigm I've been describing, without policies grounded in economic justice that neuter racist regimes and provide a pathway of economic security and self-determination for all its people, white supremacy and the despotic political appeal for divisive leadership will remain. If we think about growth, growth has become the explicit expression of our economic well-being. In isolation, growth fails to adequately capture multiple dimensions of prosperity, including human capabilities, morality, humanity, sustainability, and civic engagement. When thinking about growth, there's no accounting of distribution unless we disaggregate it. It's often hailed as being able to benefit the masses through trickle-down mechanisms, but in reality, increasingly, small groups of elite and extremely powerful individuals who are overwhelmingly white have reaped the lion's share of this economic paradigm that's existed in America. A worker-focused industrial and trade policy with direct public hiring would ensure not only net new jobs, but net new quality jobs. These jobs can be used to rebuild our public physical, health, and human infrastructure, green our economy, create a care economy for all Americans. This form of stimulus directly targeted at the American worker would provide a more efficient multiplier and stimulate more balanced growth to promote our shared prosperity. If we look at some empirical evidence, an Economic Policy Institute report entitled The Productivity Pay Gap traces the relationship between economic growth and worker compensation since the mid-20th century and finds from the period of 1948 to 1979, we can label this period a post-New Deal period, that we had dramatic economic growth where productivity rose 108%, while at the same time, worker compensation rose almost equivalently 93.2%, almost a one-to-one lockstep relationship. We can contrast that with a period from 1979 to 2018, a period that we can characterize as supply side or neoliberal economics. We had a productivity rise of about 70%, but worker compensation only rose about 11.6%. So although it was never fully extended to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, the period of high economic growth that I described before led to middle-class lifestyles becoming far more accessible. And firms benefited in this period as well. What we need to do is learn from the past and promote a worker-centered infrastructure package and make it permanent and make it by design and implementation anti-racist and anti-sexist, ensuring that everybody is included. Some past examples of when we weren't by design and implementation inclusive of racial groups was Social Security, when it was originally passed, along with the Wagner Act, we excluded, because of a Faustian bargain to get Southern legislators on board, it purposely excluded domestic and agricultural workers, whom at the time, more than half of Black men employed were in that sector and over 90% of Black women. So as Congress debates future policies, instead of asking the habitual question of how we can keep businesses afloat, policymakers should fulfill their fiduciary responsibility and focus on what is good for the American people or people in general. We should expand the conception of how we define infrastructure to include a care economy, to green our economy. We need a safe, clean, emission-free environment and universal social benefits like childcare, elder care, healthcare, and access to affordable housing. This should be coupled with an explicitly anti-racist and anti-sexist economic Bill of Rights, a Bill of Rights for the 21st century. The conception that I'm talking about of building our physical and human infrastructure by way of direct public hiring and investment in workers and worker well-being, it is not new, nor is it radical. In his 1944 State of the Union address, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he called for an economic Bill of Rights. And the first article of his planned second Bill of Rights was a federal job guarantee. With this approach, it would provide a direct source of employment, and it would trigger a multiplier stimulus effect across our economy. It would enable workers, particularly those at the low end of the labor market, to bargain for better wages, benefits, without the fear of destitution from the threat of unemployment. It would structurally change the US economy away from low-wage work towards more moderate and high-wage work. That is a feature, not a bug. And it would provide a buffer against employment transitions due to automation, climate disruption, and any technical change that might exist. It would address our 21st century physical and human infrastructure needs. And it would reduce our vulnerability to quote unquote natural disaster resulting from our unnatural climate change. The jobs could range from construction, education, health services, supportive housing, libraries, child and elder care, arts and culture, projects designed to transform our cities to green, emission-free municipalities that are more resilient as well as more sustainable. Governments, the state, federal, and local governments, Indian nations, community councils, they can conduct inventories of their needs and develop a bank of job tasks that need to be done. Priority could be given to the most urgent projects to aid the most distressed communities. The work would address our 21st century infrastructure needs. It would produce tangible public benefits. It would dramatically raise worker bargaining power. It would raise the floor and improve working conditions in general. It would reduce the adverse effects associated with job discrimination attached to stigmatized populations. It would, of course, improve our public infrastructure. It would stimulate aggregate demand, provide an automatic stabilizer with a direct source of hiring to individuals. It would address our cyclical, regional, and structural unemployment. In other words, as regions become in decline, the program would iterate in high gear and direct new public infrastructure towards those regions. It would eliminate the moral hazard problem associated with an implicit bailout for the too big to fail financial sector in times of crisis. It would transform our economy so that we would have more stable wages and better benefits for workers. So let me conclude. Our current economic system is founded upon values of self-interest accumulation without bounds, greed, and exploitation. But our economy should be grounded in different values. Values of economic inclusion, civic engagement, social equity, human dignity, sustainability, and our broad shared prosperity. We need to create a new economy that prioritizes our shared prosperity, centering worker livelihood in our industrial and trade policy. The post-New Deal era shows that government can stimulate an economy and directly serve its people. Only this time, we need to make sure that by design and implementation, these policies are explicitly anti-racist and anti-sexist. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Hamilton. I really appreciate your comments. Now, I have the extraordinary responsibility and the challenge of closing us. This is it. We are so grateful for all of the folks that participated in this conference today, for all the folks that attended and who contributed to this meaningful conversation and to this important work. You know, in light of the challenging times that we're facing, especially given quarantining and problems related to COVID-19, it's fairly exceptional that we could come together virtually and have the level of discourse that we experienced today. In fact, I found it profound, motivating, and inspiring. Much earlier during our conversation, I asked about how do we retain optimism in the face of such extraordinary challenge? And the answer is by having moments like this, where we hear that the best and brightest minds in our country are actively committed to dismantling the institutional racism and the structures that are limiting so many of our families, friends, and loved ones. Professor Hamilton just said something that I just want to remind us of. In fact, we do know from history that government can stimulate the economy. Government can be an important answer to so many of our challenges, but it cannot do so without an explicit anti-racist agenda if we are going to lift up everyone who deserves to be lifted up. Today, we heard from professors, we heard from business owners of color, we heard from policymakers, we heard from writers, practitioners, we heard from everyone that there is a path to change. There is a path towards improving the lives of so many. I'm excited to recognize the interconnectedness of so many of these issues. The systems that regulate and dictate how manufacturing and trade operate can also be interconnected with environmental policy, family forward policies, policies related to people of color and anti-racism, policies that relate to folks who are diverse genders, and so on. And when we recognize the interconnectedness of it all, we can actually make change. Thank you again. A lot of the content that we experienced today will be available via recording. I encourage you to stay engaged on the Whova app, to look for many of the transcripts as well as links to the reports that were cited today. Until the next time, my name is Elmer Moore. I'm really grateful for your time and attention. Have an incredible day, have an incredible year, and keep on doing this work.